All right, all right. Well, as we were just discussing, very, very much appreciate you being willing to spend some time today talking about your own experience with executive presence, your own perspectives on it, and the practice you've done toward it. And so, toward that end, I wonder if you can just kick things off by describing who you are and what you do.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having me and for asking me these questions. It's always fun to talk about this stuff, so thank you. So my name is Jorge, and I'm the founder and chief storyteller of a consulting firm that helps tech executives communicate more effectively and inspire others to action. I've worked with senior directors all the way down to very technical ICs to help them deliver compelling messages that drive results. So very relevant topic, something I think about a lot and I practice a lot. So excited to talk about it today.
Got it. Okay. And so presumably executive presence, presumably executive presence is important for your own role.
I mean, absolutely. It's my bread and butter. I think about executive presence as, a set of skills and behaviors that enable you to present the most memorable and compelling case possible. So every time we have a communication, we have an intent behind the communication. Normally, we're not just talking to hear ourselves speak, but rather talking with an intent in mind. And so executive presence for me is that, but in a very specific context with decision makers, often in high stakes situations. And so part of my job to convince folks that I can help them do it is to embody effective communication for different stakeholders in very short periods of time. So yes, it's absolutely something important.
Got it. You mentioned that a key element of executive presence is effective communications. From your perspective, are there any other ingredients?
So, I mean, in general, communication, I think, is a two-parter. The first part is being really good at listening. I hear some people call it active listening, but it really is about hearing not to respond, but hearing to understand. And the second part is about being to articulate concisely both what you've heard and then what your thoughts are. So that's the two kind of buckets for communication. On top of that, I'd add two more things. The first one for me is about confidence. You cannot sit in front of a room of executives and say something in a halting way because that's not very helpful. No one's going to buy into it. So you need to come across as very confident, and hopefully you're saying things that you're confident in, which is a part of like honesty and integrity. And then the last piece I want to highlight is a collaborative spirit. I think a great executive presence is someone who you could bring to the table for something sensitive and know that they will work with you to find a solution, as opposed to adopt an adversarial tone or seek to create problems or any other topic. So those are kind of how I would bucket it.
A question I didn't ask you, but I'll ask you now.
Shoot.
The role that you're playing now as a sole entrepreneur, it's similar to the role that you played at Google, advising senior leaders and helping them refine their executive presence and their messaging. But your roles prior to that really didn't have anything to do with that.
Fair. Yep.
So how did you evolve into this role?
So it's funny you should ask that, because executive presence isn't something that came naturally to me. I was trained as an engineer to solve problems. And I came out of school with a master's in engineering thinking, all right, the goal is to just build the most effective solution and then just implement it. But whenever I would see an area of my expertise where there was clearly an optimal solution, I often saw I would never get picked. People, like senior stakeholders, would often pick suboptimal solution over and over again. And I started being like mystified. Like my first thought was, well, obviously they're idiots, right? Which is what we think about people in government or senior leaders. Like, you hear that a lot, that narrative of like, well, they're obviously, incompetent, because if they saw what I saw, they would know what the right call is. But when I started really paying attention to it, I started to see that the people who were pitching the solutions that got implemented were very good at building trust, at understanding the needs and anxieties of the people they were speaking to, and about proposing solutions that seemed acceptable. It seemed to both address the concerns and pose the minimum amount of additional risk. And that's when I started getting really interested in, well, okay, how do you do that? And then I saw some really impressive people who were able to do that, all of that in like 5 minutes. And I was just fascinated. I was like, okay, I want to learn from these professionals. Like, how do you do that? So that started my journey of investigating this, researching, public speaking, researching influence and communication and stakeholder analysis and research, user research, all of these different things to try to boost my ability to get more things done through other people by convincing other people.
Got it. So it sounds like you're saying you showed up with, actually you didn't say this, but it sounds like there's some basic ingredients you showed up with.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a lot of work that you did to refine it.
That's right. I think it's a good summary. A lot of trial and error.
Okay.
Yeah.
And again, not a question I asked you, but how did you get this role to be responsible for helping senior leaders at Google who need to communicate frequently,
mm-hmm.
and whose comments are often nitpicked? How did you get the role to help them in their journey?
So it was mostly because of the trust that I was able to build with a few influential leaders first.
Mm-hmm.
And so they valued my perspective on certain things, and they could see that, hey, I could help them. And then they started kind of this referral chain. I was saying like, hey, that was pretty good advice. That was very helpful. And here's this other person who really needs to have this kind of support. Can you help them? And so that's what really kicked off the journey. And as I grew more and more confident in that skill, I started doing this part-time for free. Like it was not a mainstay of my job. And I started volunteering to support. I was, back then I was marketing. So I started volunteering to support, technical professionals present in IO or GML. And they had, lots of deep knowledge on things like, even AI or, servers or whatever it was. But to a very difficult time translating them for a non-technical audience. And Google's great because they always have this mantra of trying to bring as technical a person to the forefront as possible. And so they were proactively pushing these folks into very uncomfortable situations for them. And that's when I started, building that portfolio of being able to help. And so with that experience, then, other opportunities surface, and I was able to go for this kind of role.
Got it. Okay. I realize that you mentioned that there's a lot of work that you did to help you build your own executive presence. Are there any aspects of it that you found to be particularly impactful?
So maybe, and this is very specific to my journey, but I had always thought of executive groups kind of like clubs that were more like social clubs. And so, when I came into it, I thought like, okay, the goal is to be accepted and liked. And so, with that in mind, I was trying to optimize for, maximum agreeableness, finding things that won't make waves and smiling a lot. And it wasn't until somebody pulled me aside and said, dude, what are you doing? And I was like, what? I'm trying to like fit in. And he's like, yeah, but that's not valuable. Like you just nodding and smiling makes you look junior. And quite frankly, it makes me wonder why you're even here. And that was my first like, whoa, okay. So if you want to get invited back, the secret is how can you be a valuable part of the group? And that's what really changed my mindset on these things was, how can you bring value to the group? And I struggled a lot, specifically in areas where I wasn't an expert. I felt like I needed permission to opine about an area that wasn't my own. And then I learned that was a self-limiting belief, that if you are good at moving conversations forward. It doesn't matter whether you're an expert or not. You can facilitate a discussion and hence be extremely valuable, even when you're not, the most knowledgeable, the most expert person in the room.
Oh, interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, so if I was going to ask somebody who's been in a number of meetings with you,
Mm-hmm.
how would they describe your version of executive presence? What might they say?
Good question. I would think, the feedback I've gotten in the past is that I'm very friendly, I'm
Mm-hmm.
very energetic, but also very focused on outcomes.
Mm-hmm. And so how does that manifest itself when you say you're focused on outcomes?
Uh, so like in a typical, so as a chief of staff, my last role,
Mm-hmm.
I used to run a lot of these meetings. And
Yeah.
so I would, schedule time for like the social banter,
Mm-hmm.
like the collaborative stuff, but then I'd move on. I'd think, all right, well, that's enough of that. Let's get going.
Right. Okay.
And I was well known for giving people subtle hints to wrap it up. First starts with a ping, and then it ends with like an actual interruption, because I was, very mindful of, what is the goal of this conversation? My ultimate goal as the chief of staff, as the host of the meeting, was to solve a problem through the meeting, and I had a very carefully built agenda. And so whenever, things started to go off the rails or off topic, it was my job to facilitate and make sure that we were very much on topic.
Got it. Well, so in your career and in your last role, actually in your last few roles,
Mm-hmm.
you had exposure to a lot of people who really do project executive presence. Whether they developed it over the course of time, it came naturally to them, but you have seen it in multiple different personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Just out of curiosity, uh, are there particular traits that you've seen
Mm-hmm.
that for you are really reminiscent, probably not the proper terminology, that are really effective in providing an aura of executive presence?
I think that the most basic one is just confidence.
Hmm.
Like, I don't know if I can say this, but know your shit. Like, know it inside out.
Hmm.
Because that gives you a platform from which to be a very active, present participant.
Yeah.
I've noticed time and time and again that when someone seems distracted, or they're having moments of self-doubt or inner talk, they're not in the conversation, so they're a much less effective participant. And they constantly miss context cues. They're not being great listeners. They're not jumping in at the right time. And a lot of it stems from just a lack of preparation and a lack of confidence. And that leads to a lot of other side effects. So like the common thing is just be prepared. If you're well prepared, you will be in a really strong position.
So I suspect that feeling adequately prepared, or what is prepared enough, is a constant concern for lots of us, including lots of people who are going to be watching this video.
Sure.
And that's what's often what might undermine somebody's ability to project executive presence. Do I know enough? Do I know as much as they know?
Mm-hmm.
What advice might you provide to people to gain some confidence, even if they don't quite know whether they know enough?
So this is such a great question, because you can prepare to infinity, right? There is literally no upper limit to how much preparation you can bring to the table. But I always tell people, you should know enough to propose a solution to the problem at hand. Even if you don't know that that's the perfect solution, but you should be able to propose something. So if you don't even know enough to think about, hey, what's the possible solution to this problem? I would say you're not ready yet. And then you should look for alternatives. Like, you can either signal this ahead of time and say, look, here's this big problem. I'm not even close to a solution on this. Like, what's the expectation for the forum? Are we going to be, what can we do? And there's a lot of, normally for all these executive forums, there's a lot of people like myself in the past who can help you because they, like in my old role, I was facilitating the meeting. I wanted a good outcome. And so my job was to help participants come in with enough context and confidence that they could, add value at the right time, at the right clip. And so I always had to coach people on, do you think you're ready? And sometimes the answer is no, you know what, quite frankly, you're not ready. And so then we have to think of alternatives. Either you're not the right person for this meeting and we have to pass it on to somebody else, or if you're a big enough part of it, then we're gonna have to postpone the meeting. But showing up, not even being close to what a potential solution could look like, it looks terrible.
Let's flip things around. In many cases, you're going to be a leader, or perhaps in the meetings that you talked about, you're going to be a leader and you don't have the answers. You may be trying to extract the answers from people, help facilitate a discussion, as you said. Perhaps the direction is unclear. So you don't know your shit.
So if I could challenge that for a second, like you got to know your stuff. Like what is your role? What is your area? Like if you're the head of engineering, you got to know where your teams are. You got to know what you're doing. You got to know the status. You got to know what your potential options are, where your points of flexibility are. That's kind of what I mean by know your shit, at least, is it. You do need to come prepared.
I would say, or you need to know what your function is. Like your function, as you said a few minutes ago, is, in many cases, I didn't know what these technologists were talking about, but I'm good at moving a conversation forward. So that's your contribution to, or your projection of executive presence.
Sure.
Is, hey, I can control this room, I can control this discussion, not by depth of knowledge, but by the ability to help move a discussion forward.
Right. But also, like for instance, in my case, I guess maybe this delves into like what is your, and this may be too specific to meetings as a format, but a lot of it happens in meetings, so maybe it's fair. It's what is your role? What is your expected role? And having that clarity up front is also extremely useful. So if you are expected to be the protagonist of like, hey, the solution's going to lie with you, then yeah, you damn well better show up with something or some idea of what's going to happen. If you are a supporting role, you're here to consult on specific scenarios. Like let's say you're the legal team, right? Like you also should do if we're going to discuss a product launch, you better come ready to talk about what you understand to be the legal implications of said product launch and understand them as well as you can and all the engagements teams have had with you. And like that briefing is extremely important. And I spent a good portion of my career providing those briefings to leaders. So I know exactly that it's not a solo job, especially the more senior you get, the more teams you have that help you be ready for those kind of engagements. But that's part of what I mean about like know your stuff.
Right. Okay. There's other scenarios where showing up with executive presence or displaying it, I should say, is important. An example might be your company just had a shortfall in earnings, or you've got a layoff coming, or your team is really frustrated because they're being reorganized, or they were kicked out of participating in a project. Or you're the CEO of Google and the staff at Friday afternoons or Thursday afternoons, whatever it was, is asking you sort of random off the wall, but challenging questions. I don't know the answer to those things, but nonetheless, hopefully you know the answer to some of those things, but nonetheless, you still need to display executive presence. You need to have people leaving the room thinking, oh, that's somebody that I trust or that I want to follow. And I'm curious what you see those people doing.
So there's I've seen a lot of good and bad examples.
Okay. Yeah, and that's very
Like,
helpful.
and I think it largely depends on what the goal is. You know, I see a lot of folks who rely on diffuse kind of responses that are hard to grasp and hard to pin down as a coping mechanism. Right. And I see this a lot. And in lots of large corporates, it's super common to use extremely jargonistic filled like answers to basically dodge the question, like answer the question without actually answering the question. So you know, they'll rely on a lot of like, you know, like, hey, so are we getting reorged or not? You know, very clear question. It's like, well, we have to look at the synergistic implications of collaboration and alignment between strategic stakeholders. And after a thorough review, you know, like that kind of language is like, what? You didn't even answer the question, right?
Yeah.
So those are people who I would say that's just a straight up dodge.
And does that contribute to their executive presence? Does it undermine it, or it's sort of a neutral thing, all depending on?
I mean, they wouldn't do it if it didn't work so well. Because I do think there is a portion of like, oh, I didn't quite get it, but he said something. And it seemed, you know, he was very confident or she was very confident in the answer. So like for the people who are not really paying attention, it seems like it works fairly well. I think it depends on very much the audience and the emotional intensity they feel about the specific topic that's being raised.
Yeah.
And so I think the biggest mistakes come, or the biggest missed opportunities perhaps come from when there's a mismatch between the, you know, the emotion felt by the audience and the way the executive handles it. And so a good example of this, very recent times at a large tech company that was going through layoffs, was this question on like, hey, how can we even have psychological safety if we know we're going to get laid off? And the response was very dismissive. It was like, look, you could always have been laid off. So like that was always part of the deal. So like there's no change. And so what I felt like that answer did is it didn't really meet the emotional investment of the question. They wanted to be like, hey, look, something's changed for me. I feel hurt. I feel disenchanted. Like, how am I supposed to think about this?
Okay.
You know, you could have given the same answer, the same, you know, subject matter, but with a little bit more empathetic reception.
Yeah. A bit more of a, like, make a connection, try and.
Right, acknowledge the emotion. You know, would have been so hard to say, look, I know this is scary for a lot of folks. I know this is new for a lot of folks. I know for a lot of people, this brings additional uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but here's you know, and then you go into and that acknowledgement is a really, really big part of, I think, an effective executive presence. But again, you know, a lot of these executives are still there and they're still, I'm sure, making a lot of money. And
well, yes. Okay. I'm sure you've worked with a number of clients, both internally and externally, where having presence is a particular challenge for them. It could be that the content is great, but somehow the way they are delivering that content, whether it is their vocal tone or their speed or their confidence or their lack of confidence or their, you know, all kinds of things.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you the cheater question so that we can wrap this class up quickly. Your top 3 pieces of advice.
Yeah. So I think there's certain things that, you know, Chris Anderson of TED fame always says that the most primal thing is you got to have something worth saying. And so it's easy to coach out bad behaviors like, not having enough volume, umming and ahhing, fidgeting too much, whatever it is. Those are actually relatively easy to coach out, but it's almost impossible to coach in good content. And so the first rule,
make sure that you've got good content,
is make sure you have something worth saying. And that I see a lot of people struggle with that. Because they feel like they have to say something. So I've heard this a lot. Like, if I'm in a meeting, I have to speak, because otherwise I don't have, a presence. I have to speak all the time. And I think that's actually a mistake, because if you're speaking a lot and the stuff just isn't either relevant or valuable, you are actively doing yourself a strong amount of disservice there, in terms of building trust. So like, that's the number one thing.
Yeah.
The second piece of advice I give is to practice and record yourself. Because the most important thing about this communication is emphasizing your message. And so I'm not very prescriptive in terms of what the do's and don'ts. Like, a lot of people say, well, don't move around. Or they'll say, don't dress in a flashy way. Or they'll say, don't, whatever. There's a lot of don'ts in communication and public speaking. But the point for me really is, do whatever it is that enhances your message. And whatever distracts from the message is a negative. And so you have to think about those things. And the most powerful tool to do this is recording yourself. Also, in my opinion, the most painful thing. Watching recordings of myself speaking is probably one of my least favorite activities.
And you're not alone in that.
No, it's very simple. Some people, even like professionals, like some very well-paid stars in Hollywood, simply flat out refuse to watch themselves on screen. And they will sneak out of the premiere of their movie because they just cannot handle it, how awful it is. But it is the fastest way to improve.
And that's homework for class 1. All right. It is homework for class 1. Is there a third, or hey, you focus on those two, you're 90% of the way there?
I mean, I think the third one is around listening and just being really good at paraphrasing what you're hearing. A lot of people are super scared of doing this, especially with senior executives, because they don't want to come across as dense or too obvious. But it is extremely powerful to paraphrase what you heard so that you're answering the right question. And that's another important part about being very, very clear. It's like, okay, so I heard you say, and especially with executives that sometimes they give you a barrage of stuff, right? They'll go on for like a really long time. And what often happens in those cases is that you kind of hear the first part and you're so busy thinking about your answer, you didn't hear all the last parts. And so you start answering the first part of the question, but actually, as they were speaking, they realized that the last part was the most important. And so that you get this like fun little miscommunication game where you're trying to answer something they don't care about, and then they realize it. And so, you go into loops. So that's terrible. So the paraphrase back is extremely powerful because it is proof that you heard, and also it forces you and your brain to just listen as opposed to try to formulate a response, because the response is the summary. And so for a lot of people who find it hard to like listen because they're so busy responding, this is a really good technique.
That might be a good segue to my very last question. Presidential debates are Thursday night.
Oh, yeah.
Executive presence may be what sways millions of votes one way or another. People know these guys' policies, or maybe they don't, and they don't care.
I was going to say, like, I don't know that everybody knows, but yeah, I think we know as much as we care to know.
Yeah. And so, briefly, what advice would you give each of them from an executive presence perspective?
Ooh. Ooh, so this is a good one. This is an interesting one. I specifically hesitate to comment on politics because a lot of my work and experience has been tied on collaborative problem solving, assuming that we're all in the same boat and we're all trying to kind of find a common alternative. And a lot of what I find in political discourse is that it's much more about perception than actually effective problem solving. And so what matters most for both candidates in this case is to just project competence. And given, the perceptions in the public about age and about the effects of age on performance as the executive of, the United States, I think that would be the advice I would give is to project as much competence, presence, vigor. And the thing is, I hate myself a little bit for saying this, Tracy, because I think there's a lot of ageism in all of these assumptions. And so I would hesitate to say like, oh, you got to, show that you're on, and you got to really show a lot of energy because, old people are not associated with energy. And so, and old people are associated with memory loss and, with weak physical strength. And so you got to go out of your way to, prove these things are not true. But I don't know if that's helpful for your class necessarily.
It's probably not too relevant. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have?
I mean, I do think one of the best parts that I didn't get a chance to talk about yet, more like some of the best advice on executive presence, I got actually from Philip Schindler, the chief business officer. So in one of my past roles, I was presenting an analysis on a competitive issue that Google had in APAC with some competitors. And I was presenting to Philip and his, all of his directs, and the presentation was well researched. It was compelling. I practiced it a lot. It was good, and everybody else seemed very engaged. But I could tell he was just not satisfied. And so at the end of it, everybody shook my hand. I like, great job. But I knew he wasn't there. And so I summoned the courage and I said, hey, Philip, do you mind if I ask you a quick question? And he said, sure. And I said, what could I have done better? Because I noticed that you didn't seem very satisfied with this. Well, what happened? And he was very blunt. He's like, the problem, or what I wish you would have done, is bring me a solution. In this position, everybody brings me problems. And almost no one brings me solutions. And much later in my career, I met a senior executive who's incredible, influential, far beyond his title and scope, and super well known across multiple businesses. And he had one very specific thing that he did over and over again, which is, he always thought like the owner. Like, if he was in charge of the whole problem, what would he be worried about? What would he be recommending? And this kind of thought process always pulled him out of his own silo. Because I think the problem in a lot of these situations is that your proximity and understanding to a specific field biases your solutions a lot. And so, of course, the director of engineering feels that this problem could be solved with more engineering resources. And of course, the director of UX thinks that, well, if we only invested more in, research, we could avoid problems like this in the future, right? And so that's a natural bias of, proximity and comfort with solutions. But what he was able to do was really put himself in his boss's shoes. And then he would have very meaningful, substantive discussions about potential solutions and trade-offs that few other people could match. And I think that's one of the most kind of impactful techniques, because he learned a lot. Because when I saw him start this, I noticed he was wrong a lot. And he'd get shot down pretty quick on a bunch of stuff that were outside of his purview. But that didn't deter him. It's like, okay, well, now I know that. And so the next one would take into account, and then he'd get shut down for some other reason. Oh, okay, well, now I know that. And so, and he kept building his portfolio and his experience, and he became very, very influential this way.
Wow, interesting. In the third or fourth class, we talk about the importance of knowing beyond your role, being able to understanding the business and understanding other functions. so that you can contribute beyond your role and understand problems in a more comprehensive fashion. So I think that's really, I've seen that. I've struggled with that.
Yeah. I mean, it's hard, right? Because you don't know what you don't know, right? So it can be.
And you have to be curious. And you have to be willing to say, wait a minute, I'm going to take some of my time that I could fully be devoting to this thing and have trust that if I learn more about finance, I learn more, let's say I'm an engineering manager, I learn more about finance, or I learn more about marketing, or I can be a bigger contributor than being laser focused on my core job. Which I think a lot of people struggle with is, oh, you know what? It's appropriate. If you're not curious enough, you're going to be limiting yourself.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very helpful. I appreciate you sharing that.
No, of course.
Is there anything else that I didn't ask that I should have?
No, I think that's all I had prepared.
Okay. Okay, that's really helpful. Let me hit the recording. I'll pause the recording. There we go.